Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Thank you very much for joining us for yet another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from the 2 co-hosts, Mavis and Gail.
Hello, I'm Mavis Bauman. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome also.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a really, really special episode today because we have just an incredible guest that's joining us, and she's joining us all the way from Switzerland. So I want to introduce you to Rebecca Stevens Alder, hailing from Switzerland by way of Sierra Leone, West Africa. She's an anti-racist activist and writer on medium.com. Rebecca writes about racism through her own personal perspective, yet acknowledges that there are so many other things that she would rather be doing. So her call to action is, help me dismantle racism so that I can get on with some other things. So welcome, Rebecca.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Anita. Good evening to everybody. I'm so happy to be on the show and really excited to have this discussion with all of you.
Excellent. So this episode has been quite a while in the making. I want to say I met Rebecca like months ago, and we've just been talking back and forth. I was really impressed with her style of writing when she talks about and shares her personal narratives and experiences around racism. And this is a part of our sort of the topic of being Black globally. So every now and then we'll have somebody come on the show, particularly when they're from outside of the United States, just to kind of bring a different perspective into the mix. So we're going to jump right into the first segment of our conversation. And thank you for reading my perspective is the mantra at the end of each of Rebecca's articles. Anti-racism activism actually requires the power of perspective taking to harmonize historical truth and personal narratives as a key element of deep conversation about race and anti-racism. So what Gail, Mavis, and I did is that we each went in and selected 1 to 2 of Rebecca's articles, which we're going to dig in much deeper here. So I selected 2 articles, and they kind of sort of fall into this topical area of how racism is socialized, right? And so the first article, the title is, I didn't know I was Black until I was 9. White people made me Black. Now that title in and of itself is so packed with information. And during this conversation, we'll unpack some of that stuff that's in there. And then the second article, which is really related to this whole idea of racism being socialized when it comes to children, but then also how it shows up in adulthoods. And the second article is entitled, Why is this white cashier racist, but the one across from her isn't? So the central question is, children are not born racist, but somehow along the way, they sometimes become races. So Rebecca, based on your personal experiences, how and why do you believe that happens, ultimately showing up in adulthood?
Yes, of course, and you've made the very brilliant point that I make, Anita, in the fact that children aren't born, racist or discriminated against other children, and somehow they become that way. So I studied quite a bit of sociology, and my premise is that somehow along the way, children are socialized to become racist, either by their parents, by their grandparents, by the family, by friends. And they learn to begin to distinguish and to then sort of attach negative stereotypes to Black and Brown people. But it's not a natural state of being. This is something that happens, that children are socialized into becoming over time, but they are definitely not born with that discrimination within their hearts. That is something that comes much later on in the game. And when I talk about the fact that I didn't know that I was Black until I was 9 years old. I used to live in Africa, and in Africa, no one was pointing at me and telling me that I was Black. And when I moved to Switzerland at the age of 9 years old, that's when people started pointing at me in the streets, and that's why I began to ask myself, but am I different? And it is that look of the other onto me, projected onto me, that made me become a Black person. But I didn't ever think of myself as a Black person before that at all.
That's really interesting. So can you describe a little bit more in depth what that actually felt like to you as a child? So growing up in Africa, where most of the people essentially look like you culturally and things like that, and now you're in a society where the people don't necessarily look like you, but then they're interjecting this whole other aspect of life that you weren't even familiar with. So can you talk a little bit about what that actually felt like to you?
Yeah, it felt very, very isolating. And in the beginning, as a small child, I thought something was wrong with me because I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared to be treated differently. I actually thought, we were all different colors, but we were all sort of human beings. And so it was very isolating, and it caused me quite a lot of trouble, in my even emotional and mental development. Because all of a sudden I thought that I was wrong to be a Black person. I thought that I had done something wrong. So as a 9-year-old, you don't really understand all the intricacies of racism. You just feel, well, it's wrong to be Black. There's something wrong with me. And that can be very arresting in development. And it did take me quite a number of years because I didn't really realize that I was okay, that there was nothing wrong with me. It took me at least 3 or 4 years to begin to understand what racism was. But for those very first years, I remember not wanting to go out, not wanting to play, not wanting to eat, and just not wanting to function because I thought I was guilty of something for being Black.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of putting it, that you felt like you were guilty, that there was some guilt associated with your Blackness. And I love the second half of the title is that white people made you Black. So when you think about just kind of going from one context and another, one context in which you perceived yourself in a very healthy kind of way, and then you're suddenly put in a different context, and it's the surroundings that are making you feel the way that you just described. So that's just really, really profound. And to be able to feel that as a child. So the message is our children do feel that. For those people out there who are listening, our children feel that. And so can you talk a little bit about the second article, why this cashier is racist, this cashier is not? And so how does that contrasting thing show up for you? And at what point, maybe along the line as you were growing, that you began to see that there was a difference along those lines as well?
Yes, because when I started talking about racism, I had a lot of my friends saying, we want to experience it. We want to come with you to the grocery store, and we want to come with you and experience how it is to be a Black person. And so I attempted these type of experiments, but they were just completely useless because you never know when racism is going to strike. It can happen in the grocery store, or it can happen at the library, or it can happen at the bookstore. So you have no idea. So why I wanted to write that article was really because I wanted to show that it's always a surprise to me. I don't go out thinking that racism is gonna, I'm gonna have encounter a racist. That isn't something that I can predict. So that article is really to show how, racism can occur, but it is something that is not predictable. It's not necessarily predictable, that type of interpersonal racism. Systemic racism is predictable. The fact that you might not find a job in a particular company because they only hire white people, that's predictable. But interpersonal racism that happens between two individuals is something that is absolutely not, is not always predictable. And so that article is really showing I was in the same store, in the same environment. The only thing that changed was the shop assistant. And that difference in shop assistant was how my experience of racism occurred. So it was really important to really be able to start sharing with my audience, this is how it feels to be a Black person. You never know exactly when you're going to be a victim of it or not, especially when it's interpersonal in nature.
Yes, I totally and completely agree with everything that you just said. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Mavis, and she's going to lead a discussion around a couple of other articles that really, really resonated with her.
Hi, Rebecca. I just want to thank you again for being here. This is just such an honor. I wanted to tell you that, when I started reading your articles and how they end with, thank you for reading my perspective. It's such an inviting, it's such a wonderful invitation to just be with the subject matter and let it kind of percolate. So every article is moving in that regard. So thank you for that invitation. The first article that, that I chose is entitled 6 Ways a Black Person Can Tell a White Person Isn't Racist. Before I get off that title, I'm going to list those 6 quickly. Whether a white person looks you in the eyes, whether they convey to you that they consider you as an equal, that they believe you, that they do not make assumptions or stereotypes or tasteless jokes about race, that they seek to educate themselves about racism, and the big one, which is that they actually act against it. So those are the 6 ways a Black person can tell a white person isn't racist. The next article of yours I chose is entitled 5 of the Most Hurtful Racial Microaggressions I've Heard in My Life. And that's in your voice. And these samples of these microaggressions are, you're intelligent, you're articulate, your clothes are a little bright, you're very maternal, we don't have makeup in your skin color, or just generally insensitive skin comments. And the reason I chose these articles is because I feel like this is kind of along the first level of entering the racism discussion and looking at yourself, which is what Anita has set up as our construct. What are we thinking and believing and acting on ourselves? And I, for one, want to be extremely important. I want to be extremely careful about that. And so I, even though I've, sought to avoid offending, I've sought to learn much over the last, 30, 40 years about it, I still am concerned that I might be stepping in those places. So having the opportunities to talk in these environments is really particularly rich for me. You might have known that I grew up in an all-white community in Western Nebraska. And I remember my brother-in-law saying, he commented on a Black physician who said, well, he wasn't really Black, because he was smart and he was friendly. And even though I hadn't been around any people of color at that time, I knew that that was so bad, so bad. So there's been some infusion in my life, and I want to make sure that I mind those and that others can hear how we're doing that or how to do that. So, we were talking earlier, Rebecca, about being nice, and that nice is is good. It's good. It's not a bad thing. And it shouldn't necessarily be perceived as a false thing, right? But I wanted to ask you how you perceive that someone is being authentic with you and not posturing in a way or trying to manipulate you in some way. Like, I'm not a racist, you know, so I can talk to you this way. Can you just give us an example of what you might perceive in a situation with a white person who's just a little bit off that way?
Yeah, as you know, when we were discussing this earlier, you know, I think that Black people that live in predominantly white societies just have a sense of intuition as to whether somebody is racist or not. When somebody is racist, they have certain behaviors that they exhibit, and they're micro behaviors that we can identify. And one of those behaviors is the way that they look at Black people. And they look at Black people in a very odd way. And you can actually just feel it. And sometimes, you know, they might not be, you might be standing in a room and that person might be looking at you, and you would just feel that look on you, looking straight at you. You'll just feel it. And so there's just something that I think it's some type of a radar that we have, whereby we can really just sense. And I don't know if it's maybe the danger or if it's maybe the hatred or the racism, but we can just really sense it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it's an interesting expression that we have in West Africa. And we often say, well, that white person isn't used to Black people. And what we mean by that is that white person hasn't been around Black people much and is maybe a little bit uncomfortable, maybe racist. But I feel that as a Black person, it's just this intuition that we have. And I'll be, you know, just being very transparent. I don't think that I have ever in my life been mistaken. When I thought that somebody was racist or I thought that somebody was anti-racist, I've never actually been mistaken ever. So I think that this intuition that we have, this strong intuition, is actually quite accurate. And there are very few Black people that are going to make a mistake about whether somebody is racist, which also leads to one of the other points I make in that article is if a Black person tells you, I've experienced racism, one of the first things to do is to actually believe that person, because I think there are very few people that just go out there and make these accusations. And when we feel it, it's already a painful trauma. And having to defend, you know, whether it was right or not is another type of trauma. So the sense of whether someone's racist, we really sense it, I think, at our core.
What are you seeing today, Rebecca, that excites you in terms of these conversations that are now happening? I know that you have some optimism on board, and I've been thinking about that all day and about the potential of changing the way we think about each other. You know, just the idea of not knowing you're Black until you're 9. Of course, that's a construct that we just impose, you know, that gets imposed on all of us for various reasons, right? So what are you most excited to see, and where do you think of the potential for change is?
Yeah, what I'm excited about and very, very optimistic about today is we are having these discussions. I've been around for 50 years, and this is the first time in my life that we are having these open discussions. And the difference with about 10 years ago is 10 years ago, I'd be having this discussion with Anita and some other African-American friends, and we'd be sitting there and saying, oh, there's so much racism. And we would be having these discussions amongst ourselves. The difference with today is we are having these discussions with white people, with allies, with brown people. And that is what is making me so optimistic. These discussions, we have squadrons of people in different communities around the world having the same discussion that we are having today. And for me, that really signals a change. That is a paradigm shift. And that's what gives me this optimism, because I think that we are a force to be reckoned with. I don't think that people are shying away from these conversations as much as they were in the past. We're sitting down, we're having these discussions, and that is what is giving me all the energy and the optimism to say, we are going to bring about change. I think when Nelson Mandela was sitting in that prison in South Africa, some people sort of thought, he's never going to get out of there. a Black man will never be president of South Africa. And look what happened.
Look what
Change
happens.
happens in an instant. And that is why I am so optimistic, because all of these discussions are going to lead to that big change that we're going to see in the world.
I so agree with everything that you just said. And I often, when Gail, Mavis, and I are having some of our own discussions, because we discuss this stuff like very in depth. But one of the things that I always say is that the two of them actually model true allyship, and being able to be in this type of space, have these types of conversations. And it's a space of equity. I'll put it like that. It's a space of equity. So they bring who they are, I bring who I am. And there's a meeting in the middle of where we are. Like I talked earlier about, these personal narratives and this harmonization between truth and history and personal stories and all of that. And in this space, I created intentionally for it to be that way.
Right. If I could add to that, Anita, I've heard my, typically white friends express fear about even broaching the subject. Or did I say something wrong? Or I'm afraid of that Black person. I think that Black person hates me without even having a conversation. So I'll just tell you how I feel. I'm just not afraid. What can happen here? But good stuff by connecting with each other, by spending this time, by being a little raw and open. And I think also that Anita's done a good job of just kind of bringing sort of a universal love into this space, because this, is what it's about. In the end, we just have to love and respect each other. We're all just plain old humans.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And when you talk about the hatred, I just wanted to grab this. When you talk about that hatred, people afraid that I'm going, I can honestly say, it's not even within who I am as a human being to actually hate a white person just because they're a white person. Like that doesn't even come close to defining who I am as a person and as a human being. And I like the way you framed it up and made that connection to love. So I think, Rebecca, you were getting ready to make a comment.
Yes, I was. The more discussions that we have, the more we're going to make it just normal to have these discussions. And your friends are not going to be afraid about having these discussions. Because I think that when we come into these discussions, as a Black person, I'm also a little bit afraid. And, if your friends are afraid, the more we're having these discussions, we begin to see that there's nothing to be afraid of. And that's why to continue, whether we're doing podcasts or whether we're just sitting in a home and having this discussion, this is why we need to duplicate these discussions all around the world, and to take away that fear, because at the end of the day, we are human beings. You and I, we're just human beings, and we just need to sit down and have these conversations. For years and years and years, there have been institutions, there have been ideologies that have created that fear between people. And what we need to do is take away that fear, because at the end of the day, we bleed the same. We are the same human beings. We love other human beings the same way. So we just need to sit down and have these critical conversations. And this is what, bless his soul. Unfortunately, George Floyd passed, but his passing has actually allowed and just given us this impetus to have these discussions that we need to be having, because there's so much more that we need to take care of on the planet. We can't be fighting each other. We need to be able to talk to each other.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And the whole hatred thing, quite frankly, is such a waste of energy. Like you could really take that energy and put it into solving this problem, or put it into taking those steps towards allyship and putting that other stuff to the side, because it doesn't necessarily serve a purpose in terms of building away from where we are and into a totally and completely different future. So Gail, did you have any comments on this segment?
Yeah, I would say that, when people hate another person that they don't even know, it's really about rejection. There's a part of themselves they may hate. Maybe it's the uncertainty, the unfamiliarity or whatever, but to feel that hatred towards a group of people for people that they don't individually know at all is just, it just feels absurd to me. And And it's a fear
Unhealthy,
that
mentally unhealthy.
manifests, right? What we, as that can manifest, we can also manifest the opposite, which is love and acceptance and understanding, right?
Exactly.
I believe that.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to take a break now. And then when we come back from the break, we're going to go into the third segment with conversations with Gail and the articles that really resonated with her. So we'll see you back in another minute or so. Well, welcome back. You are listening to Inflection Point podcast on Transformation Talk Radio, and we've just been engaged in a very dynamic conversation with Rebecca Stevens Alder, and we are going to jump into the third segment of our conversation, and Gail is going to lead us down that path.
Okay. Again, thank you, Rebecca, for being here. This has been an amazing experience for me, and I'm so grateful. So the first article that I chose that you wrote, and you're an unbelievable author. I just love reading multiple articles, but I chose America was birthed in violence and will fall to violence. And it was written May 30th, I think the date of the article of 2022. So bullying and violence of the indigenous people by the white supremacists who discovered America that was already inhabited. So there was a lot of violence at the core of our beginnings as a country. And just as the progression of and the development of wealth was created through the abuse and violence of and the dehumanization of Black people, who were literally taken, stolen from their own country, just to dehumanize and to justify their own abuse of those people. So there's all that violence. You're right, we did start this country that way. And even the use of, I know the next article I read from you was on how I defeated my racist bully. So my concern, going back to the first article, that if that is true, and that is certainly true, whether people want to look at that history and that reality or not, but we have the ability to change that. And you talked in your second article about how I defeated my racist bully, which I absolutely loved. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through this experience, that when you moved as a child to Switzerland, that you were bullied there. And if anyone has ever experienced any bullying, then you know how horrific that is and how alone you feel. And your mother had a brilliant idea to teach you with judo or one of the martial arts. And so when I read that article and what happened, and I'll let you tell it, but it was absolutely brilliant. And it was a skill. It was not violence. What happened to you was violent. But what you chose and what you did to protect yourself was not based in violence. It was based in self-protection and a skill that you learned, and you learned it obviously very well. So I want you, if you could talk a little bit about how that happened, because it's a great story. But my question is that if fear and insecurity and violence really created our country and it's continued to in so many overt and covert escalations, will humanity awaken? Do you think humanity will awaken and have a zero tolerance for any form of racism or violence against another, and all the different various forms that takes, and even bullying in schools and bullying with young people and adults? Or do you think that we will somehow emerge and awaken to disable that self-destructive pattern that we have all experienced at some level, and certainly witnessed not just directly, but through the remembering of what happened? Or will we wake up and remember that we all came from the same source, that we came here knowing this truth, that we really were all created equal? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that, I truly believe that 80% of people in the world are good people, are very good people, and that their intentions are good. So I do feel that we will awaken. And the way we awaken is by having this dialogue, like the one that we're having right now. Because I don't think the dialogue has to happen. And we need to acknowledge that there has been bullying, there's been pain, and there has been suffering, whether it's against African Americans, Africans, Indigenous people. We have to recognize that, and we have to have these conversations to say, this happened, And, whether it's reconciliation or whether it's apologies, once we have these discussions, then we can move on to the place where we say, okay, we need to sort of put this behind us, and then we need to start basically addressing some of the major challenges that the world is facing, whether it's global warming, whether it's feeding an increasing population, whether it's basically clean water, drinking water for all. So from my perspective, yes, we do have that capacity to really basically come together or come out of this violence and this bullying and this aggression. We do have that opportunity, but for us to get there, we are going to have to organize ourselves, and we're going to have to want to have those conversations and really, really want to move into that different place. So it's going to take a lot of work. And that's why it's important to start organizing ourselves, to have people that are, into social justice, into making sure that we have racial justice. This is why it's important to not only have these conversations that we're having, but to basically have champions for this, and champions across different age groups, across different socioeconomic levels, across different countries around the world. But we're a force to be reckoned with. And so for me, I take the stance that yes, we will emerge out of that aggression. We will get out of it, but it's going to take effort. It's going to take work, and it's going to take willpower.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I really do that. And I think we each have a part in it. And we can do the work by starting just to look within ourselves, right? To look at if you have anger, hate, then look where the fear lies within you, right? Where is that anger, hate towards yourself that gets projected onto somebody you don't even know? And to really be able to step into that place of truth and honesty within, and then have those conversations, to begin those conversations and dialogues. And really a conversation where we speak and the others listening, and then they speak and we listen, to really be open to hearing and understand and increasing our own awareness.
Yeah.
Exactly. And for me, the whole anti-racism movement, or being anti-racist, is educating oneself. And, first of all, having that willingness to wanting to be better and to educate oneself. And once you start on this journey, there's no turning back. When I started writing about racism, I sort of thought I would write one article about my experience and that would be it. But once you start unpacking racism, what it is, this artificial construct, you want to get rid of it because it's just so unfair, and it's so steeped in injustice and in suffering and in pain. So anti-racism is also very similar. So people that embark in this journey, not being afraid about unlearning stuff that you've learned, because I've also had to unlearn things myself, because I've grown up in a society that is steeped in white supremacy. I've had to unlearn things as a Black person. I have had to unlearn unhealthy white supremacist thinking. And this is what we all have to do, is just having that period of time where you unlearn, have these dialogues, these discussions, and then want to move into that post-racial society that all anti-racists are really aiming towards.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we touched upon this when we were talking earlier today in preparation for this, but one of the things is this idea that these conversations are happening at such a ground swelling level. And it always reminds me of Pandora's box. If you remember the story of Pandora, when she opened up the box and all this stuff just flew out and nobody could put it back in. I feel like that's where we are now. All of these conversations are being had, all of this different perspective taking, this idea of listening intentionally and listening intently and listening for the purpose of understanding what does all of this actually look and feel like through the perspective of someone who is actually oppressed by racism. So we're in that place where no longer are we going to be able to just explain it away. We can't make a law that'll make it go away. We can't ban all the books in the world. We can't ban virtual Zoom. We can't, all these things that we are not able to make the stuff go back into the box. And so we're going to be forced into making some changes. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally agree. And we should just refuse to put it back in the box. We should refuse. And this is what I'm most proud of, is the anti-racism movement, as you say, is a groundswell. And day after day, I'm seeing more writers, more activists, young people, older people, and everybody sort of saying, we want to dismantle this thing. And nothing could give me even more joy, because I actually think at this stage, I'm already happy with what I've achieved. And I'm already happy seeing how the world is changing. It's given me all this energy because I feel nothing's going to go back into that Pandora's box. We are at the point of no return. And it just feels so good to say that about fighting racism, to be at the point of no return. We cannot go back to the way things were.
We have to have tolerance for that. We have to.
That's what, isn't it Jeffrey Robinson who was talking about the tipping point, how improvement has occurred and we get to this precipice and then we fall back. We aren't doing that anymore. We're going to come over that hill to this post-racial society. And, frankly, I don't know what people are so afraid of. Everyone would benefit. This is a win-win deal. Like Anita was alluding to earlier, this is a win-win deal. Less suffering, better apportioning of resources and so on. Excuse me, Rebecca, go ahead.
I'm so excited about the topic, but I totally agree. There is so much to gain. With diversity, we are going to be able to resolve so many of our global problems. We need to have diversity of thought. We see it in corporations. More diverse organizations perform better. And that's the same case for the world. A more diverse world is going to be a better place to live in. So I totally agree with what you've just shared.
Just for some historical perspective, I studied Black Studies at the University of Nebraska in the 80s. And I remember feeling that we were sort of in a bubble, that there wasn't this flow of conversation in and out of the classroom. That's a long time ago. We should be so much further ahead, but the point is the momentum is there now, right? Yeah, so we'll keep it going.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate when you think about it, it's unfortunate what we had to experience in order for us to get to this moment. Even when you think about the pandemic, because going through the pandemic, you begin to realize, oh, wow, a lot of those frontline workers, those first responders, those are Black people that are, that are working in those hospitals. And I mean, not exclusively, obviously, is not what I'm saying, but you just begin to see how present we actually are. And so then you also began to see how there are disparities in the healthcare system. You start hearing all these stories about how this group of people within the context of the healthcare system is treated one way, and then this other group is treated another way. And all of these myths and stereotypes are buried within the healthcare system. So it's just been all of this exposure, and I in all of this, I go back to when George Floyd was killed. And I believe it was his daughter who made the statement, my daddy's going to change the world. And that's exactly what's happened. The unfortunate thing is that it took that type of incident to blow the lid off, so to speak. But I think we are in that place where there's an opportunity for just this to gain momentum over the course of time.
Exactly. And people tried to stifle that momentum. I remember people saying to me, this is just a fad. It's just going to go away. And I remember just feeling very nervous because I was like, I can't let that go away. I have to continue writing about racism. I need to continue my activism because I don't want the sheer voice. I just don't want it to disappear. And there's so many Black people around the world that were anxious because, we thought it was just going to be in the media cycle and gone. And the thing is, what you're saying, sustaining this movement has taken a lot of energy, but I am so happy that we have been able to sustain it.
I don't think we have to sustain it. We have to, right? It's more that's beyond time. And I think we all have the ability to participate at whatever small level or large level we can but we all have the ability to use our voice. It's like the stories that you've written about that, how you have experienced anti-racism, and they're just very human stories of what you have experienced in your life. And just to put that out there for people to read and understand and feel that, right? That, I mean, that's a huge contribution that you're making.
Mhm.
Really
And when
is.
I read your story, the first story that, or the first article that I mentioned, you didn't know you were Black until you were 9 years old. I had shared with Mavis and Gail about my daughter. But I have two daughters. My older daughter, when she was at a particular school, I think she was going into like junior high school, and it was not the best school from the standpoint of there were some racial undertones in this school, right?
Yeah.
But there was one particular day when I picked up my daughter from school and we had a conversation. And in that conversation, she told me that she hates to go into the office. And I said, well, why? Like, you know, you just, maybe you have to go deliver a paper, or, you know, if you were a few minutes late or something, you have to stop past the office. But what she told me was every time I go in there, the woman who was like the assistant principal, she makes me feel like gum on the bottom of her shoe. That was such a powerful statement for, I think she was
child.
either in like 7th or 8th grade. And I told her, you make sure you remember what that feels like, because that's that radar that Rebecca was talking about earlier. She
Yeah.
was only 13, 14 years old, and it was already like embedded in there that I have to kind of be careful kind of thing. So we are almost completely out of time. Our time is winding down, and I wanted Rebecca to give us some closing remarks. And if you have a call to action, website, anything like that, that you want to call out for our audience. And Mavis and Gail, any final comments that you also want to offer are good.
Good. I just want to listen to Rebecca right now.
My call to action is really join, you know, for everybody that's listening and for all of their friends and all of their families and everybody that they know, is to join this anti-racism movement, because we need to make this world a better place. We need to make it a better place than how we found it. So we need to be, whatever it is, no matter how small, being a part of this anti-racism movement, whether it's educating, buying a book about anti-racism, you know, whether it's joining a discussion or setting up discussions in your community. You know, it doesn't need to be televised or on a podcast, but just bringing some people together to discuss racism and anti-racism, but be a part of the movement. I think earlier on when we chatted, we talked about the spread, how COVID-19 spread around the world. And yes, it's a horrible pandemic, and it has caused a lot of tragic loss of life. But the way it spread around the world, I remember thinking to myself, if anti-racism could spread around the world, if it was as infectious as COVID-19, we would really be in an incredible place right now, you know, heading towards this post-racial society. So my call to action is that, you know, be engaged in anti-racism. You don't need to be young, or you can do it at any age. You can be from any socioeconomic group or level. Do your part to fight racism. And that's the call to action. Of course, I write on Medium, and I'd love for you to follow me on Medium. So I will be giving some of my Medium details for the website. But my call to action is just be involved in this fight, no matter how little, you know, be a part of it. Be a part of the future.
Absolutely. And that's a great thing that you say. You frame it up like that, be a part of the future. When we first got started, I don't think I've ever had the chance to share with you, Rebecca, one of the things that really prompted all of this work on my part is my grandson, Cairo. So I have this 2-year-old grandson, and my daughter asked me, it was around the time after George Floyd was murdered. My daughters were about to go out and participate in a Black Lives Matter march. We had a conversation about generational protesting in my family, from my mom to me, and now to my daughters. And my daughter asked me, her name is Olivia, and she asked me if I thought that Cairo would have to protest in his lifetime for his birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born. So that question became that Cairo question became the fire that sparked the work that we're doing now. I wrote a book about it, and then I started getting this idea about doing this podcast. I met another organization that Gail, Mavis, and I are connected to. Is called A Long Talk, and their whole entire mandate is to get to the point where people are having anti-racism conversations at the dinner table.
Every dinner table.
Yes, at every dinner table, where this conversation becomes so commonplace, because the idea that we can create a different kind of future so that Cairo will not have to protest, and all the other little 2-year-olds that are out there right now will not have to protest for that same basic right. So Mavis, any other comments? Gail, I think we still have a little bit more time.
Well, they would have to,
go ahead, Gail.
but also that they wouldn't have to feel the fear. They wouldn't have to feel that radar coming up. That, and your radar is the energy that you pick up from the other person's own emotions of hate, but their hate is fueled by fear. And so you feel that fear too. So for anybody to not have to ever feel that from another or towards another, I think would be remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do
Yeah,
that.
I was reading an article earlier today, and it was an article where Ibram Kendi, the author of Stamped from the Beginning, was interviewed. I forgot which news channel or whatever that he was being interviewed. And it was all around the book that he wrote, the Anti-Racist Baby, the one that Tom Cruise, when, under Judge Brown's confirmation, when he kept bringing up this book, this anti-racist baby book. And so he was really going through this whole entire conversation about how we inadvertently or sometimes intentionally educate our children to be racist. And so we could just as easily and intentionally educate them to be anti-racist, because we already have a blueprint for how to do it wrong. So why not use that same type of methodology, which is really basically education and talking and all of that, and building relationships and that sort of thing with our children, to making sure that the children are a part of these conversations as well. So,
Anita, sorry, we're talking.
No, go ahead, Rebecca, please.
Yeah, this anti-racist baby. So the one thing I think with anti-racism, it has to be deliberate and intentional, because I think our society, it's almost, when you talk about unconscious bias, being racist is basically on the motherboard in a lot of families. And so anti-racism has to be a deliberate effort to unlearn and to teach your children anti-racism. So for me, anti-racism can't be just something that you just expect the kid will pick up. You're going to have those discussions with your children. It is a deliberate and intentional undertaking.
So I have a question for you, Rebecca. Do you think you'll ever write a book?
Yeah, I'll definitely write a book, Anita. I have so many people that have written to me and said, write a book. It wasn't my intention. It wasn't my intention to write a book about racism, because I have so many ideas in my head about books about science fiction. As I say, that's what I wanted to get to. That's why I want to dismantle racism, so I can write the other books in my mind. So, but I will write a book about racism, and I will write my science fiction book, but definitely, I will. I think from the very beginning of time, I am a writer at heart. So I definitely will.
Excellent. So Mavis and Gail, we just have like a few more minutes. You want to call out your website so people can kind of get a understanding of some other things you do besides Inflection Point podcast?
I just was wanting to make a comment earlier that relates to what Rebecca was talking about. I'll call out my organization, Seed a Better Life. It is set up to help educate and feed children in Rwanda who are impacted by the genocide. And this whole thing about moving beyond the horror of a genocide and really the horror of racism in our country. There are so many parallels, so much that I've learned that I can bring as my own constructs to this conversation. I can know how bad it can get. So please go to my website, read a little bit about what we're doing, seedabetterlife.org. Thank you.
All right, Gail.
Go ahead, Gail.
The nonprofit that I'm part of is called OMA, Center for Mind, Body, and Spirit. We have a bunch of different programs. We have some trauma-informed training. We offer a program once a month for any survivor of any kind of trauma that we have a panel discussion and we talk about different aspects of it. We have a youth program. We have a lecture series that we highlight on holistic practitioners under the mind, body, spirit categories. So we offer a lot of different things. So please feel free to check it out. It's www.oma.pittsburgh.org.
Excellent, excellent. I'm going to leave you with this final quote. Look closely at the present you are constructing. It should look like the future you are dreaming. And that is from Alice Walker. And if you want to know more about the work that I do, you can visit theplacetosoar.com. So I just want to thank Rebecca and obviously thank Gail and Mavis for always being there with me and all of that. But Rebecca, you have been a true blessing for us in this episode.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Our paths cross again.
Yes, I'm sure they will. So for those of you who are listening, I thank you for joining us in another insightful conversation from Inflection Point podcast. So you can catch us here on Transformation Talk Radio every first and third Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern time. Eastern, not Easter, Eastern time. And we'll see you in the next episode.
I hope you get a good night's sleep, Rebecca.
Yes.
Thank
Go to sleep.
you. Thank you so much. I will.
Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.